Hi, how are you doing? It's a real pleasure being with you today. It's real hot down here in the MotorCities region, so I hope to give you a real cool presentation today. Actually, today what we're going to be discussing is Ford's involvement in the arsenal of democracy, with a focus on World War I, World War II. Ford was truly real responsible for us winning those awards and making this Detroit Motor Cities heritage area a center for the democracy, arsenal of democracy. Um, our story begins by knowing a little bit about the founder of the Ford Motor Company. His ideas often made decisions that were unusual and unpredictable, but it's very fascinating. Henry Ford was born in 1863, right during the Civil War. As a child, Henry grew up hearing all kinds of stories about the Civil War and seeing a lot of the poor wounded men come back from the war. Some of them were neglected. Anyhow, Henry's resentment of war was created way back when he was a young man. He later became a pacifist. In 1915, he actually launched or helped launch a ship, the Oscar, and it was called the Peace Ship. And he attempted to stop the turmoils that we had with in Europe at the beginning of World War I. It failed. But in 1919, though, Henry Ford owned the entire Ford Motor Company and was on his own. Our story today starts back in 1917, when America entered World War I. Henry jumped on board, even though he was a pacifist, because he really liked the president, President Woodrow Wilson, and he were on the same wavelengths. So Henry Ford got involved with World War I and jumped into it. Henry Ford had worked as a young man at the dry dock workers downtown Detroit, actually fabricating ships of that era. And because he had a knowledge of that, when the war started, Henry proposed and applied for a contract to establish Ford Motor Company with a naval contract to build submarine chase boats. And this was quite an interesting contract. The Corps of Army Engineers actually agreed to dredge out the canals behind some property that Henry Ford owned. That happens to be where the Rouge facility is today. It is the Rouge complex early on, just before World War I or during World War I. And we're building these submarine chase boats called Eagle boats. We got the contract and the government helped us fix up the property, dredge this canal that you see behind you out to the Rouge River. Rouge River led out to the Detroit River and so on. And Henry Ford, decided we'd build these ships like we build cars on an assembly line. We also got the contract to build Model T ambulances for the war, which made the Model T, just after the war, a great hit in Europe because the Model T was so durable, and of course it represented something very nice. Here's an interesting picture. You see nurses out there on the lawn of Highland Park practicing with these ambulances. That's the powerhouse, which no longer is there in the background. We also got another contract in World War I to build aircraft engines. Ford built almost 4,000 of these 12-cylinder engines for the airplanes. Amazing. We also built a small tank, a 3-ton tank for World War I, and lots of ancillary items such as helmets for all of the men in the war. Thanks to America getting involved in the war, it ended quickly and the celebrations took place everywhere. Note this famous picture which appeared on most newspapers. It's a Model T leading the parade, saying war's over. Henry was glad that the differences got resolved quickly, and he could now get back to producing vehicles. Unfortunately, only 20 years later, turmoil again broke out, and our pacifist was asked to get involved. He wasn't exactly eager to jump into World War II and let everybody know that he was unhappy that this was not resolved at the end of World War I. And because he was a pacifist, he really deplored getting into another war. But as the slide shows, on December 8th, 1941, it plunged us into a whole different arena, and war was declared naturally on Japan, and we jumped in and we got involved quickly. Two unlikely characters kind of came face to face. Henry had a lot to say about not settling the differences after World War I and thought that another war would just make everything much, much worse. Henry finally agreed to help the nation, and the war started up again. Naturally, he wasn't too warm to Roosevelt because Roosevelt was very much on the working men's side, and the rest is history, we know. The Ford men and women had unionized at Ford. We were the last major automotive company to settle with the union, only months before Pearl Harbor. So we were now called upon to unite in the most unbelievable way. This photo actually shows the last car coming off the line there. There's a couple pictures of two different cars. Switching over to war goods and training to build new items was monumental. You know, we hear a lot about the virus and how we've changed over to making ventilators and so on. This was times, I can't imagine switching over to all these facilities. It was monumental. One of the first contracts we got was to build Jeeps. Jeeps were built by Willis Overland down in Toledo, Ohio. But they couldn't build enough. They didn't have enough capacity to build that many. So Ford, the government gave Ford a contract to build what we needed to fill the contracts and get the men their vehicles that they needed quickly. So Henry Ford and the team changed the specs on the Jeep to make a Ford Jeep almost exactly the same, but changed it so it could come down an assembly line quicker. Willis's assembly line was different than ours. Soon these personnel carriers were coming and being assembled by the thousands coming out of these plants that had once built cars. It looked strange to see these Jeeps coming down a Lincoln assembly line. Amazing. You know, Ford was very proud, and it shows in these ads, which we ran in all the major magazines and that. Henry Ford overlooked being a pacifist and literally jumped in wholeheartedly to the effort. New tooling had to be constantly created. Amazing. The tool and die shops in Dearborn were working 24/7, making the new tooling to make the new parts. Support for our troops was paramount, and Ford was building more and more items to serve the front lines. And we ran ads advertising what we were doing for the war effort. Two actual types of tanks were being built now, World War II. One had tracks on it, treads, and the other one was for wheeled use. Interesting. We also built a variety of other vehicles. Amazing how many of these we built, these heavy truck transports. Hundreds, thousands of these we cranked out. Amazing. Also, we built an interesting vehicle. We built an amphibious war vehicle. And, we used to test these in the Detroit River. I have a great photo, I didn't include it in here, of these coming down the Detroit River with large freighter ships passing them. It was quite a sight, trust me, all these little amphibious vehicles being tested. The infrastructure, the people are a story all in their own. The men were being drafted in the Army, so there was a shortage of workers. We had to recruit workers from a lot of different areas we never imagined. Women, you've probably heard it, came into these manufacturing facilities and never really worked in heavy production ever before. But now they were in the swing of things. And everything, just like this virus, is changing the way we work. One of the most unique items that Ford won a contract to build was glider planes for landing silently behind enemy lines and that. We got involved in this, and it was an amazing project, actually. Made sense, though. The planes were made from primarily wood and cloth, so they'd be very lightweight. We produced them up north in the Upper Peninsula at our Iron Mountain facility, which later became Kingsford. And we built them. What we were building there before was parts for automobiles. We built the wood for the woodies and a lot of the wood that goes into vehicles. People don't realize how much wood was in older cars. Amazing the number of board feet of lumber. And it was all milled basically in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Now they switched over to building these glider planes. The plant, like I said, was located in Iron Mountain and became the largest employer in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Now these lightweight gliders were being built there. Another thing that's interesting to note, this is where they developed super glue because they needed the parts to dry quickly before they could get on to the next assembly. And as you see down in that lower left-hand picture, there were a lot of little parts. It was like building a model for any of you that have built a stick and cloth model. Amazing. These CG-4A planes carried 15 men and a Jeep or a Hauser gun, whichever one they wanted to put in there. Ford produced over 4,000 of these planes during the war, making it the largest producer of glider planes in the world. I wanted to tell you a brief story here. I think I've got time. It's amazing, but the pilots of these, the ones that were still around, I had a great opportunity to interview them. And these were death traps. Landing was terrible, but if you wanted to take this plane off, they picked it up by having a plane fly over the top of it and out about 200 feet in front of it, 200 yards, I should say. There was a big hoop on a stick, and the plane grabbed that with a hook and jerked you up in the air. All of them claimed that the seats broke right off and they all ended up in the back of the plane. And if they weren't careful, the Jeep and everything went right out the back, and they'd go out the back with it if they weren't careful. Unbelievable stories. Forget that. The next slide is the most ambitious project that we got involved with during World War II. This is legendary. During World War II, there was a shortage of planes. And at the time, the B-24 bomber was very, very accurate and could carry a good payload. So that was the plane early on in the war that they chose. It was built by Consolidated out on the West Coast. But Consolidated could only build about one of these a month. Well, if you do the addition, you get 12 planes in a year. That wasn't going to cut it. So they had to expand the production and get these built someplace else. Henry Ford, Ford Motor Company, bid on this contract and said, we think we can build this about maybe every 4 to 6 days. We can build these planes. We got the contract to build these. We were awarded the contract, but that meant we had a lot of work to do. The man who headed this up was none other than Henry Ford's own son, Edsel Ford. He's a good guy, and he really took an interest. He was always interested in aviation and was instrumental in developing metal planes in the 1920s. Ford kind of partnered with Bill Stout, who was one of the few that believed metal airplanes could stay up in the air and were much more durable than that. Edsel convinced his dad, and the two of them backed them, so he was very knowledgeable about making planes. The best, earliest planes, like the Ford Trimotor, really started off metal airplanes. So we took on this contract. The property was selected in southeastern Michigan, near a small stream called Willow Run, thusly the name. It was farmland. In fact, Ford owned a lot of the farms in this vicinity. And they actually, ironically, were there to help the sons from World War I with food. Vegetables were raised by a variety of people using mechanisms out in that area, and it was sold to raise money for these victims of World War I. So we had the property. We called on none other than our old buddy Albert Kahn, who designed most of our famous big factories, to build the longest factory room on Earth. It turned out that it was more than a mile long. These are just a couple facts that you see up there. It took 200,000 gallons of paint to put the first coat on. There were 580 miles of steel girders and just shy of 30,000 panes of glass, which of course constantly had to be replaced because of breakage. People had to be sought to run this facility and man it. Most of the able-bodied men, as I said, were being drafted. Many more women were entering the workforce. Amazing. Change, big, big change. Here's the workforce, the breakdown. Amazing, amazing. 61% turned out men, 39% turned out women, and there was a 56% labor turnover because the men kept getting drafted. A lot of the women didn't enjoy the hard labor and that, so there was a huge labor turnover that was going on. Unbelievable. Each new assembly phase, no matter how simple or how complex, required training. We set up training like you wouldn't believe. Unbelievable. And we brought in specialists to do this training from all around. There were people that knew these different trades, and we'd bring them in to teach them the best, most modern methods available. Ford is where Rosie the Riveter came into play. Each plane required, I know it's hard to believe, each plane we built required 350,000 rivets. Most of these were done by hand. Where did all these new people live? Unbelievable. Guess what? When we started this project, Ypsilanti had only 4,000 residents. Willow Run at the peak needed 60,000 people. Homes and housing projects were put up unbelievably fast. almost probably too fast. But where did the people stay until those houses were put up? Well, they'd stay in some of the hangars and that. This is an unbelievable picture, you know, but it reminds you of a disaster area or something. And I guess the beginning of World War II, it was a disaster. We were scrambling. In the meantime, Henry Ford was now meeting with the Air Force generals on a daily basis to help Edsel, his son, get this launched. Giant Pratt and Whitney Ford engines were produced to power this B-24. Each specialized plane part had a different area in the plant that it was constructed and then brought to the assembly line, much like a vehicle is even today. Each piece was taken to the final line for assembly. This was pretty much, like I said, like assembling a car just before the war and the way we assemble them today. Some of the parts were manufactured at Ford's other various locations, especially in the area, and brought over to Willow Run to apply in the final assembly. Here's a B-24 at the famous L shape coming down the plant. Now, there's a funny story about that L. You know, Henry Ford had a lot of unusual thoughts, and one of them was he didn't want to pay extra taxes for going over the county line. So he made them make an L shape in the building so he could avoid paying extra taxes. Unbelievable. One unique of the employment opportunity was that we started employing a special but so important regiment to our workforce. We employed 400 little people. We sought them out from carnivals, circuses, other walks of life, because they were able to perform tasks that a bigger person couldn't get involved in. So consequently, it sped up the production, and these people were really a part of the workforce. Quick story. I interviewed 2 of these people much later in life. But they said to me that if it wasn't for the Ford Motor Company, they would have never had dignity. But they were able to, in the same cafeterias, got the same pay, carpooled out to Willow Run. Amazing, great, great humanistic story. You know what? We had to set up infrastructure like you wouldn't believe. Medical facilities had to be supplied. Food services were monumental. Can you imagine feeding 40, 60,000 people? Unbelievable. Ford supplied the needed personnel and the equipment on a monumental scale. Pilot training was also very important to this whole project, because you know what? Once the plane was made, you had to get it out of there. Otherwise, they backed up on the tarmac and you had a big mess. So pilots were coming in, farmers, everybody was coming in to be a pilot to fly these to the East Coast and to the West Coast, both parts of the war. Unbelievable, unbelievable logistics. Soon all the facets of the operation were working, and the team and the employees were so proud of their achievements. The Willow Run Assembly Plant became a heroic American icon. I cannot tell you how the newspapers all across America focused on Willow Run. Will it work? Can we make this happen? Will it win the war for us? Unbelievable. All eyes were focused on this facility. The Rouge plant was also very busy at this time building parts for this B-24. Even entertainment out at Willow Run was so important. You had to do something with all these people, especially the ones living very close. So we set up our own state-of-the-art broadcast studio and had our own channel that we broadcast to, bringing all kinds of entertainment. that Ford was not unaccustomed to having bands at different functions and that. Amazing. And different star entertainers showed up too. The planes were adding up, and the effort was paying off. America was starting to turn the course of the war, and these B-24s were making a huge difference. Here's a few statistics during the run. It is definitely a Ripley's Believe It or Not story. There's a whole bunch of those planes out on the tarmac waiting to be delivered. You know what? Each plane, as you see on the chart there, had 152,235 parts. Unbelievable. As I said before, 350 rivets. We built a total of 8,685 planes in only 2 years. Hard to fathom. We finally got it down. This is the Ripley Believe It or Not party. Remember, Consolidated built one a month. We ended up being able to build one an hour. Hard to believe. I want to take this time to say we cannot forget the sacrifices of our veterans. They gave to flying these planes. There were a lot of people in these planes when they took off. It took a lot of skill and bravery to win the war, and these planes were their tools. Ford was very instrumental, like I said, in winning World War I and World War II. And the B-24 bomber project was the greatest of all of the war efforts that we took on. We probably wouldn't be sitting looking in our computer today the way we are if it wasn't for all those men and women who worked hard to give us our freedom, and we should never forget that. Finally, in 1945, peace was achieved, ironically, through war, the thing that Henry Ford hated. And World War II started to wind down. Peace was created along by a pacifist named Henry Ford. His name is still just as famous as it was back then. And I'm very proud to say that I worked for a company which helped keep America free. I really am. Now listen, I saved time here. I think that's what I was supposed to do for questions. So I'll be glad. I mean, I just skimmed the surface. So, fire away. I might not know the answer, but I can find it.
Okay, well, thank you, Bob. We do have a couple questions that have come in.
Okay.
And so we'll get started with those. Again, I would just remind everyone that you can use the Q&A icon at the lower portion of your screen to write down your question for Bob Kreipke. And we'll get started with one from Bill Greenwood.
Okay.
This is, what was the impact of the conversion to wartime production on Ford's financial situation?
Well, that's a very interesting one. Because the company was owned solely by Ford and his wife and his son, they had money. And because Henry Ford he hated finance, he hated borrowing money, Henry Ford kept cash, gazillions of dollars of cash. So we had a way of getting into this and plunging into this using a lot of the personal money, plus which you have to remember, just like today, somebody in the government is paying for those war goods too. There's no secret about the fact that we got paid for those. However, I believe that we were very economic in developing these. For instance, that plane, the B-24, we brought that in at tens of thousands of dollars cheaper than anybody else was bidding on. So to answer your question, the finances didn't really play into the company that much. A lot of people say we emerged out of World War II and we were broke and devastated and all this other stuff. That is Not true. We definitely had to get back on our feet and start selling cars, which is always cars and trucks, which has always been our bread and butter, still is today. Thank you. Thanks, Bill.
Okay. Next question comes from Steve Purdy, and this is regarding an unusual vehicle that was built during World War II. Did Ford build the Burma Jeep? Do you know anything about that particular
I don't know
vehicle?
that was a version of the Jeep that was built exactly for the Pacific Arena, to my knowledge. I don't know a lot about it, but it was a variation, and I believe we did build some of those actually at Dearborn Assembly. I hope I answered that. I don't know. I have to look up more about that.
Right. Given the success of Willow Run, this is a question from Mitchell Fleischer. Why didn't Ford get more involved in the aircraft industry after the war?
Well, that's always been kind of a controversy. It's no different than why we didn't carry on after the 1920s when the Ford Trimotor was the greatest plane at the time. And we kind of dropped that too. There was a reason for that, a kind of a strange one. Henry Ford wanted to build an airplane for each individual. He thought he could make planes like Model Ts, little flivver planes. That failed back in the late 20s. So he was disgusted and thought, well, there's no market to help the personal person in this endeavor. After World War II, we had to scramble to get back in the automotive field. And airlines were just starting to beef up after the war. And we didn't get involved. Those B-24s were far from being a passenger plane. So, you know, it would have been a whole redesign. But that's basically the reason, was kind of like we decide today why we didn't get into motorcycles and trains and all that other stuff. We're basically a car and truck company.
Okay. Here's a question from your fellow MotorCities board member, Bill Nichols. He was once told that superchargers were designed and built at the Rouge that allowed our bombers to fly at high elevations and do daylight bombing. Is that true?
That is true. Superchargers were actually around for a long time. As you know, supercharger forces air into the carburetor and does get a better kick out of them. These bomber planes needed that acceleration. If you go down the highway today, there's superchargers on all your big trucks. You'll hear them humming when you get near them in that. Bottom line is, the answer to that question is true. We did put superchargers on those Pratt & Whitney engines.
Okay. Next question is from Jill Engel.
Yeah.
What is the status of the Ford land in Washtenaw County today?
Well, all of that property, all of our holdings, it was often said that Henry Ford had millions of acres of property, and it's probably true. In fact, a little side note, he never gave most of his executives bonuses ever. He'd give them property in lieu of a bonus. They didn't like that too well, but nevertheless, we owned lots of property in Washtenaw County. It was said at one time that if you started in Dearborn, you could walk to the Ohio border without leaving Ford property. I don't know, I never tried it, but that could be possible. What is happening today? In the 50s, for the most part, in preparation for going public in 56, we sold an awful lot of that property off in the 50s. Henry Ford II was instrumental in liquidating a lot of that, but there are still parcels of property. I was amazed when I was there full time. I'd get a call, and lo and behold, the acreage was still in Ford's name. So the answer to your question is, some is being used, some is being repurposed, and a lot of it got sold.
Okay. Our next question comes from Russ Doré, another Motor Cities board member. Did Ford also manufacture the engines for the B-24?
Yes, we did. At Dearborn Engine and that. We had to depend on suppliers also. But you see, the way it happens when there is a war is that you trade designs. The government gets involved and there's money switching hands and all that good stuff, but you help each other out because you need volume and no one supplier can make enough. Now, we got the plans, we build engines too for those B-24s.
And they were Pratt & Whitney designs?
I'm sorry, what?
They were Pratt & Whitney designs?
Yes.
Okay. Next, we have a question from Don Graham. The question is, was engineering accomplished with number 4 pencils and slide rules during the 1940s?
Yes, that is very true. It's hard to believe that we could have pulled this thing off. I don't know how you did it. I don't even know how they handled supplies and all that stuff. I mean, it must have been lots of paper and pencils. Yeah, that's how they did it. That's part of the Ripley's Believe It or Not story. And you know, when they were building that B-24, let me tell you, I'd say a third of those parts in that plane needed to be redesigned on the spot because they were just off a little bit, or the blueprints we got from Consolidated didn't match our new ones. Unbelievable. I don't know how they did it. You know, we rely on computers today, obviously, but back then, boy, there must have been a lot of good brain power computing.
Okay, we're going to look to Richard Russell for our next question.
Okay.
He says, I heard due to shortages in housing that some of the early Willow Run workers actually had to share sleeping quarters across the 3-shift operation of making B-24s. Can you comment on the infrastructure support needed to support the manufacturing operation?
Oh yeah, well that was unbelievable. As I mentioned in the presentation, for a while we had great big areas in some of the hangars where we had cot after cot after cot. And the answer to your question was yes, they did do that. And I don't know if they had to share those cots from shift to shift, but I wouldn't be surprised, especially at the very beginning. And I know that there were tent cities out there near Willow Run. I mean, it was unbelievable. That's all I can tell you, unbelievable. And it's a great study in sociology and what human beings will do, you know. And they were doing it in the name of their country, I'm sure. But it was a hardship.
Okay, our next question is from Taylor Rebhan. What was the effort like in returning to normalcy on the assembly lines? I guess this would be after the war. Did many of the laborers continue to work for Ford producing peacetime vehicles? And did those specific factories for the B-24s stay in use?
Well, there's a whole bunch of stories there that we could branch off on. Needless to say, many women found that life fine and they stayed on as workers. Naturally, men that came back from the war, there were rules even back then that they had to be reemployed in their old jobs and that. Naturally, just like probably today, some of those jobs went away and new technologies changed, even the new technologies we learned in World War II. But the workforce did come back. We did start building cars again. I'd hate to have been an HR person and try to figure it all out, but it was rather smooth, smoother than I would have thought. Not only that, but please remember, big item. We had already settled the union disputes a month before World War II started. So consequently, all of that was kind of solved. So there wasn't, I mean, there always is a management union issue, but the major ones were already taken care of. So the transition was not that hard, and it was a smattering of people, some carryovers, some coming back from the draft, and there was a pent-up demand for cars. So we had to really get going.
Okay, we just have a couple quick ones left. We're running close to the end of our hour here. So we had a quick question from Margaret. Why did the engineers use number 4 pencils as opposed to number 2 pencils?
I don't know. Maybe it made them feel more important. I don't
I'm
know.
guessing maybe the number
We could
4
erase them quicker.
are a little lighter and able to do more detail work rather than the more wider number 2s is my guess.
I really don't know. And I don't know for a fact that they did use number 2s a lot too.
Okay. And lastly, from Rich Dobson, on a more personal note, what years were you with Ford, Bob?
I feel like I was there from 1903, but I wasn't. I had joined the company in 1975, and I retired in 2017. So I was there a long time, and saw unbelievable amounts of change. I kind of watched us slide into the computer age, and trust me, and in automation, robotics, vision systems. I mean, unbelievable changes. And a lot of you know I worked in photography, the motion picture department for years. And we'd go out and document these changes. And it was, I couldn't believe it myself.
Yes, if Brian, if you could put my my slide back up for a preview of next week's Motor Cities at Home program. Before we'd certainly like to thank you, Bob, for sharing this unbelievable story of Ford Motor Company and the Arsenal of Democracy. Next week, we will continue on a similar theme, break it down a little further with the story of Rosie the Riveter. And our presenter is Allison Beatty. She is a volunteer who does a lot of work with the Yankee Air Museum, which of course is located on the grounds of Willow Run, the airport, and near the plant site. That's going to be 1 week from today. That's Thursday, July the 16th, the same time at noon, 12 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. If you enjoyed this one, we'd love to see you again next week for that presentation. You can go on our website and register to be part of it, motorcities.org, and Motor Cities at Home is a tab right there on the top of the homepage, and you can get involved in that one. We also have another program coming up Thursday, July the 23rd, about our Southwest Detroit Auto Heritage Guide, which is a new portion of our website that's going to be going live in the next couple weeks. And you'll get a great intro to that and the wonderful history of Southwest Detroit in the automotive industry with that program. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. We had some wonderful questions. And again, we'd love to see you next week. Thanks for participating. We'll see you next week for Motor Cities at Home, number 6.